There's this idea going around America that the United States is on the brink of another civil war. Whether or not that's true, I think it would be helpful to go over the causes of the last Civil War. You know, the one with Abraham Lincoln, slavery, that sort of thing. Well, actually, there's a whole lot of people who still believe the Civil War was not actually about slavery. But instead of responding to the random people on Twitter who say that, I want to pick apart one of the biggest videos on YouTube that perpetuates the lost cause myth. The US Civil War was not fought over slavery by Leather Apron Club. In case you don't know who Leather Apron Club is, he's a YouTuber with nearly 100,000 subscribers, and his supporters doubtlessly enjoy such videos as whether or not ancient Romans were gay, and how many Jews exactly have been on the Joe Rogan Experience. But instead of attacking Leather Apron Club for anything political, I want to specifically address his claims as historical claims, and show with unbiased evidence from the time why he's wrong. Why the US Civil War was actually about slavery. And guess what? You can be a Southerner, you can even be a conservative, prideful Southerner, and still understand the historical fact that those 11 states seceded back in 1860 and 1861 to protect slavery. Denial doesn't change reality. This is What, Why, How, and that's what the video's about. If you like this sort of thing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow for early access to future videos. Okay, Leather Apron Club's central thesis, which we'll see in a minute, was that the Civil War was caused by tariffs.
Tariffs. That's the tariff. There were a few more tariffs, and taxes. The tariff, if you don't know, it's basically a tax on imported goods. The North was fighting to protect the tariffs they had imposed on the South and to preserve the Union. And only later did they pivot, I think for tactical reasons, to saying they were fighting for slavery. The South, on the other hand, was basically fighting for tax reduction and free trade, because they wanted to import those goods from Europe without these massive tariffs that were being imposed upon them. This is, at the very least, undeniably what started the war.
My thesis is that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. Leather Apron Club doesn't provide any real sources. Maybe we can excuse that because he's like sitting out in the woods or something. So let's just first look at the most obvious sources we can find. Now, wouldn't it be convenient if several southern states specifically explained why they seceded? Well, they did. To set the scene, Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 presidential election, which terrified the South since Lincoln and the Republican Party opposed slavery. In December 1860, South Carolina declared its secession from the United States. It cited repeated violations of the Constitution by the northern states. What were those violations? Maybe like tariffs or something like that? In a declaration called the Immediate Causes, which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal union, South Carolina specifically stated, an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations, and the laws of the general government have ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. Several states have enacted laws which either nullify the acts of Congress or render useless any attempt to execute them. In many of these states, the fugitive, that is, a fugitive slave, is discharged from service or labor claimed, and in none of them has the state government complied with the stipulation made in the Constitution. It goes on for a bit about that, then says, thus, the constituted compact has been deliberately broken and disregarded by the non-slaveholding states, and the consequence follows that South Carolina is released from her obligation. Those states have assumed the right of deciding upon the propriety of our domestic institutions and have denied the rights of property established in 15 of the states and recognized by the Constitution. They have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery. They have permitted open establishment among them of societies whose avowed object is to disturb the peace and to allure the property of the citizens of other states. They have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who remain have been incited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection. A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. On the 4th day of March next, this party will take possession of the government. It has announced that the South shall be excluded from the common territory, that the judicial tribunal shall be made sectional, and that a war must be waged against slavery until it shall cease throughout the United States. The guarantees of the Constitution will then no longer exist. The equal rights of the states will be lost. The slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government or self-protection, and the federal government will have become their enemy. We therefore, the people of South Carolina, by our delegates in convention assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, have solemnly declared that the union heretofore existing between this state and the other states of North America is dissolved. So on and so forth. In case you weren't paying attention, South Carolina seceded to protect slavery. In fact, slavery is mentioned 18 times in that document. Tariffs, taxes, or anything like that are mentioned 10 times. Just kidding, 0 times they're not mentioned. It's not some mystery. South Carolina made it absolutely clear why it was seceding from the Union, and the reason was to protect slavery. Some people might say, oh, it's evidence that they thought the North was going to be tyrannical. But to what end? To what end would the tyranny be? The abolition of slavery. That's what they disliked. But you know what? South Carolina was just one state. Did the other ordinances of secession talk about tariffs, maybe? Well, let's look at Mississippi, which seceded on January 9th, 1861. It also drafted up a declaration explaining very clearly why it seceded. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has been long aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin. There are a bunch more lines, but guess what? They're all talking about slavery, including the resistance of the North to returning people fleeing slavery, and a charge that the North advocated for Negro equality. How about Georgia? The people of Georgia, having dissolved their political connection with the government of the United States of America, present to their Confederates and the world the causes which have led to their separation. Very convenient for us today. For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. They're talking about the North. They have endeavored to weaken our security, to disturb our domestic peace and tranquility, and persistently refuse to comply with their express constitutional obligations to us in reference to that property, and by the use of their power in the federal government have striven to deprive us of an equal enjoyment of the common territories of the Republic. They're talking about banning slavery from the territories. This hostile policy of our Confederates has been pursued with every circumstance of aggravation which could arouse the passions and excite the hatred of our people, and has placed the two sections of the Union for many years past in the condition of virtual civil war. For example, Kansas. Our people, still attached to the Union from habit and national traditions, and averse to change, hoped that time, reason, and argument would bring, if not redress, at least exemption from further insults, injuries, and dangers. Recent events have fully dissipated all such hopes and demonstrated the necessity of separation. The rest of the document lists all the usual grievances we just heard about the North in regards to slavery. But any honest person, of course, and I'm honest, would mention that parts of this document talk about tariffs. Oh my God, is Leather Apron Club right? Did Georgia secede because tariffs? No, Georgia is clearly angry about tariffs, but it just lists the economic protections enjoyed by the North not as a cause of secession, but as character evidence for the corrupt and greedy nature of the North. Then it points out how tariffs were reduced with the 1846 Walker Tariff, establishing the principle of free trade, so the corrupt classes of the North saw this and felt it and cast about for new allies. The anti-slavery sentiment of the North offered the best chance for success. An anti-slavery party must necessarily look to the North alone for support, but a united North was now strong enough to control the government in all of its departments, and a sectional party was therefore determined upon. Time and issues upon slavery were necessary to its completion and final triumph. In case you need a translation, Georgia literally just said that tariffs were no longer a major issue, that the major issue was instead, now, slavery. It accused the North of attacking slavery for the cynical reason of destroying the South, amassing greater power for itself, but the issue is slavery. That's how you would describe Georgia's reason for secession if you were an honest person, to protect slavery. I can keep going. Later on in the video I will, but let's just do one more state right now. Texas mentions slave 22 times and tariff, tax, or anything like that 0 times in its explanation for secession. Here's an excerpt. All white men are and of right ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights, that the servitude of the African race as existing in these states is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experiences of mankind, and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator, as recognized by all Christian nations, while the destruction of the existing relations between the two races, as advocated by our sectional enemies, would bring inevitable calamities upon both and desolation upon the 15 slaveholding states. We could even get into some speeches, we could look into some other debates, but I think I'm going to hold off on that for now. I think I provided some pretty strong preliminary evidence that the Civil War was caused by slavery. So let's listen to what Leather Apron Club, the guy the video's about ostensibly, let's see what he has to say.
So, was the U.S. Civil War fought over slavery? I'm making this video basically to inject a whole lot of needed nuance into a subject which has become widespread and political. And these are kind of the two most dangerous things you can have as a combination for a political talking point. One, because if it's widespread, this means it needs to have been stripped of all of its complications, of all of its nuances, in order to cater to get in the mind of the lowest common denominator. So you have a very, very simplified narrative, and it's political. And I think what political means is that it's been bestowed with enough importance in somebody's mind that they actually go out and advocate for this thing and fight passionately for this thing. But when you have that with a simplified narrative, you don't really have the force of a well-reasoned argument to get it to stick into someone's head. So you need some sort of substitution. And almost all the time what happens with these types of situations is emotion is substituted for a well-reasoned argument. So you end up with these arguments.
You know what? I agree completely. There is always a risk of bias, especially with something like a civil war, which is why it's important to actually look at the sources. You shouldn't automatically trust anybody, you shouldn't automatically trust me. That's why I am citing the sources and putting the links in the description so you can double check me. You can make sure I'm not lying. Leather Apron Club doesn't do that. He doesn't have any sources, he doesn't have any citations, he's just kind of winging it. And furthermore, I'd argue that as much as people use emotion to argue against the Confederacy, pro-Confederates today do the same thing. On Twitter, you can find people spending dozens of hours every day LARPing as Confederates, despite evidently not reading any of these documents. YouTube comment sections are filled with people like that. They're probably below right now. And you know what? It's probably gonna suck to be Southern Patriot 99 and have the albatross of slavery hanging around your neck. But to be honest, it's just not history's problem. Historical truth doesn't care about your weird Robert E. Lee LARP. Get over it. Anyways, Leather Apron Club continues.
So you end up with these arguments like slavery was the cause of the Civil War, which are very, very oversimplified, removed of all nuance, and perpetuated by emotion. So it's ironically, these are the subjects which most desperately need to be discussed, but which are the hardest to discuss. And I'm choosing to do it because, it's the benefit of having a YouTube channel with 14 subscribers is you can more or less say whatever you'd like. So anyways, was the U.S. Civil War fought primarily over slavery? I'm going to argue that no, it was not. Now, slavery was a factor, but it was a factor of a larger picture. Primarily, the U.S. Civil War was fought for economic reasons. And more generally speaking, pretty much all wars are fought for economic reasons. This shouldn't really be a controversial statement.
Leather Apron Club is making a major mistake here. I'll repeat what he said. All wars are fought for economic reasons. In the description of his video, he says the Civil War was largely an economic war, with the clear implication that this is a counter-argument to the Civil War being about slavery. He even says it again later on. Now, he doesn't directly say the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery because it was fought over economic reasons, but that's what he's arguing. He's making the case that tariffs are a much more realistic cause for the conflict because they're an economic factor and all wars are economic wars. Except there's one major obvious issue to that. Slavery was an economic system. The South's entire economy was based on slavery. Any political faction in the North that was hostile to slavery was hostile to the cornerstone of the Southern economy. You don't have to just trust me, the Southern states literally said it. I spent a couple minutes reading that at the beginning of the video. In fact, one of them said it was the cornerstone of the world economy. Southerners estimated the total value of slaves in the Confederate States to be worth more than $2 billion in 1861. Some more moderate estimates put the number closer to $3 billion, and that's not adjusted for inflation. If it was, it would be dozens of times larger. As economic historian Roger L. Ransom puts it, that roughly equaled the total value of all farmland and farm buildings in the South. But Leather Apron Club didn't even need to find this information. He could have just looked at the US Census for 1860. It's on Wikipedia, but you can also look on the actual US Census website. Slaves made up 31% of the population of Virginia, 44% of the population of Georgia, 55% of the population of Mississippi, 45% of the population of Alabama, 57% of the population of South Carolina, 47% of the population of Louisiana, 33% of the population of North Carolina, 25% of the population of Tennessee, 30% of the population of Texas, and so on. So nearly 6 in 10 of all the human beings in South Carolina were enslaved. And of course, being slaves, the products of their labor were not theirs to enjoy, but rather their masters'. Gerald Gunderson estimates income from slaves represented more than 30% of the total income of free citizens in the 6 Gulf states of the Lower South. In fact, if you look at the chart he produced, there's a pretty predictable correlation between how important slavery was to a state's economy and whether it decided to secede or not. As he puts it, thus, the reactions of slave owners to the abolitionists, or for that matter to any program which implied some reduction in the returns from slave ownership, was much more than a gesture of regional identity or pride. It was a reaction propelled by a substantial self-interest of an amount much greater than any minimum level at which resistance by the threatened parties would reasonably be expected to develop. But this should be obvious to anybody. And it's a bit dumb that I have to tell Leather Apron Club that slavery was an important economic system in the South. Anyways, let's fast forward a bit.
So anyways, yeah. People should be intensely skeptical of this narrative that slavery was the only reason that the Union, the North, fought in the Civil War. And I'm going to go a little bit into the nuance and hopefully convince you that it was basically just a boring economic war, just as everything else. And then slavery entered into the picture, I think, later as a moral justification as well as a tactical move.
Wait a second. The North didn't cause the Civil War. New York didn't secede, Massachusetts didn't secede, the Southern states seceded in December 1860 and early 1861, and it was the Confederate States that fired the first shots at Fort Sumter in April 1861. If you secede from a country, triggering a civil war, and then shoot at the government, you have to bear the responsibility of causing that civil war. If you want to understand the cause of the Civil War, it makes zero sense to look into what Abraham Lincoln was thinking in his brain, because Abraham Lincoln didn't fire the first shots. He didn't secede. We already looked at the secession explanations for South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, and Texas, and all of those discuss protecting slavery as their exclusive goal in secession. Georgia even mentions tariffs as an unimportant issue. What about the other Confederate states? After South Carolina and Mississippi was Florida on January 10, 1861. While their ordinance of secession didn't mention any specific reason, just a few days beforehand, their secession convention overwhelmingly adopted a resolution declaring all hope of the preservation of the federal union upon terms consistent with the safety and honor of the slave-holding states has been finally dissipated by the recent indications of the strength of the anti-slavery sentiment of the free states. Therefore, and then it has a paragraph declaring Florida will soon secede. Nothing about tariffs there. So let's put Florida in the column of seceded because of slavery. Next was Alabama. The actual ordinance of secession it adopted specifically mentioned Lincoln's hostility to Alabama's domestic institutions, which obviously means slavery. That's how they described it. A more loquacious ordinance was narrowly defeated. That one specifically declared compromise could be reached if the North gave up its fight over slavery. In case you still doubt me, beforehand the convention unanimously adopted a series of resolutions, including one that said, a sectional party known as the Black Republican Party has in the recent election elected Abraham Lincoln to the office of President and Hannibal Hamlin to the office of Vice President of the United States upon the avowed principle that the Constitution of the United States does not recognize property in slaves, and that the power of the government should be so exercised that slavery should, in time, be exterminated. Therefore, then it said Alabama wouldn't submit to the federal government. So Alabama obviously seceded to protect slavery. They basically said that. Next to secede was Georgia, which we talked about at the beginning of the video. After Georgia was Louisiana. Now, Louisiana's ordinance of secession didn't provide a specific justification, but the delegates at Louisiana's convention debated several other measures to respond to the crisis. In total, about 50 out of 130 put their names down on those measures, which specifically said all these things were in response to the North's hostility to slavery. None mention anything about tariffs, by the way. Ultimately, Louisiana approved an abbreviated Ordinance of Secession without an explanation on January 26th, but I feel pretty comfortable counting protecting slavery as their motivation, since that's all they talked about in the build-up to that. After Louisiana came Texas, which we covered in the beginning of the video. Then there was a several-month gap during which the fight over Fort Sumter began. So ironically, the Civil War started before the teams were even made up. Now, if I was being lazy, I could just include all the previous states, all of which were pretty clearly seceding because of slavery. The ones afterward were not necessary to start the Civil War because the Civil War already started before they seceded. Now, the last states are the most complicated ones because they seceded after Abraham Lincoln began his controversial preparations to fight in the Civil War. But let's look at Virginia. Virginia's convention formed a Committee on Federal Relations, which on March 9th issued a report about the whole crisis, where it declared African slavery is a vital part of the social system of the states wherein it exists. Any interference to its prejudice by the federal authority or by the authorities of the other states or by the people thereof is in derogation from plain right, contrary to the Constitution, offensive, and dangerous. Now maybe the Committee on Federal Relations went rogue. Certainly some delegates disagreed with it, but they actually wanted more extreme reports that condemned the North even more for going after slavery. On March 19th, the committee made another report proposing several constitutional amendments to protect slavery. That's how they thought they could resolve the crisis, by protecting slavery. That was the whole issue. I've scrolled through most of the convention, and all the debates were bickering over the language of the introductory paragraph of the ordinance and the details of the amendments to protect slavery. Nobody disagreed that the amendments to protect slavery were needed in response to the current crisis. There's nothing about tariffs, which you think would be on top of their to-do list if the whole thing was about tariffs, wouldn't you? Since Virginia was such an important state, there's even a book on this convention, Showdown in Virginia, edited by William W. Freeling and Craig M. Simpson. They've even collected a bunch of speeches, so we can see if the secessionist firebrands wanted to secede to protect tariffs or something. Or maybe slavery. One speech we should look at was George Wythe Randolph's speech on March 16th. In this speech, he actually does discuss tariffs, oh my god, and how the North's tariff system is contrary to the interest of the South. But the whole point of him bringing up these tariffs, as he reveals, is to try to convince Western Virginia to secede. As he says, in the eastern part of the state, where slave labor preponderates, we do not feel northern competition to such an extent as Western Virginia. We find the population of Western Virginia restricted in the main to agriculture, and to an agriculture not very productive. Why is this? It is because their labor is exposed to the overwhelming competition of the North. Let not Western Virginia suppose that she has no interest in the slavery question, because she owns but few slaves. She has a vast interest in maintaining the equilibrium of our systems of labor. So clearly he's trying to poach Western Virginia by proposing tariffs as an alternative reason to secede, because Eastern Virginia doesn't care about tariffs, they care about slavery. Even then, Randolph literally said 1 minute later, the greatest of all wrongs, one which in my judgment would require separation from the North if they had never otherwise injured us, is the translation of anti-slaveryism to power, the change from passive sentiment to energetic action. While the anti-slavery sentiment was merely speculative, we had no right to complain, but now that it has become an efficient agent in the government, it is no longer safe for a slave state to remain under that government. So actually people in Virginia did talk about tariffs as a secondary issue to slavery, and really as a way to get parts of the state that didn't care about slavery to secede, and even then, it didn't work, hence West Virginia, which didn't secede. Another speech, this one by George Richardson, mentioned a new strong tariff passed by the North as one reason for Virginia to secede. But guess what? The previous paragraph says, to the Southern Confederacy alone can we look for a community of interest for strength and for real sympathy in the maintenance of that most sensitive and vital of our domestic institutions, slavery. Right after mentioning the new tariff, he says, we will then rest under the wise and statesmanlike Constitution of the Confederate States formed by Southern slaveholders for the benefit of Southern slaveholders. So, Virginia mentions tariffs as a secondary issue. Slavery, specifically protecting slavery, was the main cause of secession for Virginia. Next is Arkansas. Now, interestingly, Arkansas's first convention decided not to secede, but Governor Rector delivered a message on March 2nd that said, "The golden chains once bracing up the loins of the Union have been rent in twain by the very hands that forged them. Georgia and South Carolina, matrons among the original 13 states, have thrown off the galling fetters and struck a second time for unrestricted liberty. Since they have exercised this abstract right, are they morally justified in what they have done? Have they, in the light of heaven, been sinned against, or are they sinning against others? Their offense, like our own in the eyes of the northern people, is slavery. That institution is now upon its trial before you, and if we mean to defend and transmit it to our children, let us terminate this northern crusade by forming a separate government in which no conflict can ensue." I mostly just included that for the weird imagery of loins. Anyways, on March 6th, the Arkansas Convention adopted its Ordinance of Secession. While it blames Lincoln for warmongering, the first line says that gripe is in addition to the well-founded causes of complaint set forth by this convention and resolutions adopted on the 11th of March. Okay, so we can flip back to the 11th of March, and here's what they say. Oh my god, a bunch of stuff about tariffs? Just kidding. It's about how Abraham Lincoln was going to attack slavery. In fact, they even proposed several amendments to help resolve the crisis, all of which deal with slavery. Arkansas even wanted an amendment to specifically prohibit black people from holding any government office anywhere. Let's look at Tennessee. Back on January 7th, 1861, Governor Isham G. Harris addressed the Tennessee General Assembly, where he very thoroughly describes the North's hostility to slavery using all the examples that we've heard before, plus more. He also proposed some constitutional amendments to protect slavery, but was pretty clearly in favor of secession if slavery could not be safely protected. But Leather Apron Club could just read the first sentence of the second paragraph. The systematic, wanton, and long-continued agitation of the slavery question with the actual and threatened aggressions of the northern states and a portion of their people upon the well-defined constitutional rights of the southern citizens have produced a crisis in the affairs of the country and caused secession. Tennessee went back and forth over whether to secede for some time, but Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers tipped the scale in favor of secession. The governor convened the state legislature again and declared support for secession. While the complaint he spends the most time on is the new dictatorship of Abraham Lincoln, the reason he identifies for the entire crisis, including the North's unholy crusade, is hostility to slavery. So again, the motivation here is to protect slavery from a new dictatorial North. I mean, he specifically identifies the southern states as engaged in resistance to the encroachment of abolition power. Anyways, Tennessee then put the question up for a vote, and the people voted in favor of secession. Now, we can't interview all 155,000 people who voted, but you know what? Let's compare the map of the slave population based on the 1860 census to a map of the results of the Tennessee secession referendum. Predictably, there's a pretty strong correlation between a county having more slaves and the same county voting to secede. What a strange coincidence. Now, if Leather Apron Club was making the argument that the Civil War was fought to resist northern tyranny, that would be one thing. I don't think that's a very strong argument, since after all, Tennessee viewed northern tyranny and abolitionism as the same thing. But Leather Apron Club didn't make that argument. He made the argument the Civil War was fought over an economic cause, specifically tariffs. That's definitely not why Tennessee seceded. The final state to secede was North Carolina all the way on May 20th. Well, technically some referendums happened afterwards, but whatever. Anyways, North Carolina's ordinance also didn't provide a specific reason, but we can look into the context to get a good sense what everyone was thinking about who voted to secede. For one, Governor Ellis gave a speech back in November declaring that Lincoln's administration would be a threat to slavery. Basically, everybody in the South thought that, right? Then came 1861. The General Assembly passed a bunch of new laws to protect slavery. On January 31st, they prohibited emancipation of slaves by will. On February 23rd, they passed a new law declaring any person who by words shall endeavor to excite in any slave or free Negro or person of color a spirit of insurrection, conspiracy, or rebellion, such person so offending shall be deemed guilty of felony, and on conviction thereof shall suffer death. The same day, the General Assembly passed a new law declaring no free Negro or free person of color shall be permitted or allowed to buy, purchase, or hire for any length of time any slave or slaves from then on. On May 11th, the General Assembly passed another law declaring any free person who helped a slave insurrection would face the death penalty. At the state convention, everybody agreed to secede on the same day. Now, a delegate named Mr. Badger submitted a paper with a longer explanation. He accused the Republican Party of being hostile in its declared principles to the institutions of the southern states of the Union, but also listed the usual criticisms of Lincoln, especially his actions at the start of the Civil War. But it looks like they didn't vote on this and just approved secession without explanation. So what does this mean? Well, we're going to have to look for a historian for a little extra guidance. Lucky for us, a historian named Joseph Sitterson wrote a book called The Secession Movement in North Carolina back in the 1930s. Now, at the time, in the 1850s and 1860s, there were a lot of newspapers that were very politically charged. The journals in favor of secession weren't talking about tariffs, but the danger of abolitionism and the North. The Salisbury Banner described the alternative to joining the Southern Confederacy as follows: "Do you desire the millions of Negro population in the South to be set free among us, to stalk abroad in the land, following the dictates of their own natural instincts, committing depredations, rapine, and murder upon the whites? This is the best that we can expect. It is the natural consequence of abolitionism." The Unionists had enough power in North Carolina to stop the state from seceding for a while, until, of course, the attack on Fort Sumter, Lincoln's call for troops, and the secession of Virginia, which almost instantly destroyed virtually all Union sentiment in North Carolina. But of course, the hardline secessionists didn't just pop out of nowhere. They were the same ones from earlier in the year who wanted to secede to protect slavery. So now you can see the complications. It's impossible to disaggregate North Carolina's fear of abolishing slavery from fear over Abraham Lincoln's actions. But Abraham Lincoln took those actions because other states seceded, and they seceded to protect slavery, and the core of the secessionist crusade in North Carolina was always from the start to protect slavery. What changed between December 1860 and May 1861 wasn't the desire to protect slavery, that was always there, but North Carolinians' view of the danger of Abraham Lincoln, i.e., whether or not he could actually attack slavery. Okay, that was a really long section, so I want to rewind and listen to Leather Apron Club's quote again.
So anyways, yeah. People should be intensely skeptical of this narrative that slavery was the only reason that the Union, the North, fought in the Civil War. And I'm going to go a little bit into the nuance and hopefully convince you that it was basically just a boring economic war, just as everything else. And then slavery entered into the picture, I think, later as a moral justification as well as a tactical move.
Now, the reason we talked about the South's motivation to fight was because they decided to secede. They shot at the federal troops. The Civil War was started by the South, not Abraham Lincoln. But Leather Apron Club wholly invents a narrative that hasn't existed since the Civil War in the South, that slavery was the only reason that the Union, the North, fought in the Civil War. Nobody believes this. Nobody has ever said that. Nobody thinks Lincoln set off from the start on a crusade to abolish slavery, except for people in the South in 1861. Now, there's no way to prove a narrative doesn't exist, but we can look at history textbooks from the 2000s when Leather Apron Club and I would have had a U.S. history class. Here's what a 2003 Texas edition of a popular U.S. social studies textbook says about all of this. Lincoln won the election, but without winning any Southern electoral votes. Southerners feared that Lincoln would attempt to end slavery, not only in the Western territories, but in the Southern states as well. Southerners also worried that they would have no voice in the new government. Lincoln said to the South, "We must not be enemies." However, many on both sides viewed the other side as their enemy. Lincoln responded to the attack on Fort Sumter and its surrender by asking Union states to supply 75,000 soldiers to put down the Confederate rebellion. Lincoln believed this could be done quickly. Lincoln's call for troops so angered the states. Lincoln believed it was important to keep these border states in the Union even though they were slave states. That is why in 1861 he continued to say that his aim was to hold the United States together, not to abolish slavery. The conflict between the states arose for a number of reasons. For Lincoln and his supporters, the main reason for fighting the war was to preserve or keep together the Union. However, other supporters of the North believed they were fighting to end slavery. Southerners fought the war to preserve states' rights and slavery. They also believed they were defending their homeland and their way of life. Okay, so there you have it. It's probably a bit friendlier to the Confederacy than you'd find in a non-Texan textbook today, but there is nothing in there to suggest Abraham Lincoln fought the war to abolish slavery. But Lincoln didn't start the war. The Confederates seceded, and they seceded to protect slavery. I think a major problem with a lot of these lies my teacher told me conservative types is that they genuinely don't remember what they learned in school, so they assume their misassumptions are what their teachers told them. But you know what? I want to touch on another major point. Probably the biggest strategic mistake that Leather Apron Club makes on a purely argumentative level is vagueness of thinking and language. He seems to have a script in front of him. I don't know what the issue is. What I mean by this is throughout the video, he uses cause and fought over interchangeably, as in arguments like slavery was the cause of the Civil War and the Civil War was fought for economic reasons. Now, in my book, there is an actual difference between the cause of a war and what it was fought over. I would argue the root cause of the Civil War was escalating disputes over slavery. You have the Compromise of 1850, you have Kansas, you have all these things that we all know about building up over time. But the Civil War was fought over many things. Abraham Lincoln, as Leather Apron Club himself says, wanted to keep the Union together. He did not prioritize abolishing slavery. Southerners fought for all sorts of reasons. Protecting slavery was a major one. I'll talk about all that in a little bit. But you know what they didn't fight for? Lower tariffs. The Civil War wasn't caused by tariffs, and neither was it fought for or over tariffs. So either way Leather Apron Club poses the question, his answer is wrong. Now, despite using them interchangeably, Leather Apron Club does pose the question of cause versus fought over.
And before we start, I want to even talk a little bit about philosophically, what does it mean for a war to have a cause? How do we determine the cause of a war? This is a bit of a nuance which is entirely stripped out of this entire conversation. So let's start with it. Can the cause of a war said to be what starts it in the first place? Or is it what continues it? Or is it a combination of both? And if so, how much? A lot of times cause could be just the prime mover of these actions, you know? And if it's the case that it's just the initial thing that leads to war is the cause, then slavery had practically nothing to do with the Civil War. If it is a combination of the initial motivations combined with motivations later throughout the war, then it had something to do with the war, but arguably still not that much. Not that it wasn't that important. Also, whose viewpoint do you take? Who do you ask what the cause of the war was? Do you ask the elites fighting on either side? Oh, and by the way, which side do you ask, the victor or the loser? But if you ask the elites, how do you know that they're actually telling you their motivations? How can you trust the cause of the war that the elites give?
Okay, he does a Jordan Peterson meandering rant for a while more, but I can appreciate what he's saying, even if he never actually applies it to his video, because he uses cause and fought over interchangeably. In the end, he gets it completely wrong by saying that slavery had practically nothing to do with the start of the Civil War. We just spent however many minutes going through each state's reason for secession, and slavery was the key factor in all of them. But while the Civil War was caused by the South's fear that Lincoln would attack slavery, why did people actually fight in the Civil War? Let's hear what Leather Apron Club has to say about that.
And then you get even another question beyond that. Say that, because a lot of people will say, like, you know, okay, the Southerners who were fighting in the rebel army, they didn't actually own slaves, so they weren't fighting for slavery, but they were sold a bag of goods. They were sold this lie of, you know, we're fighting for states' rights and things like that. But the question to me becomes, even if that was 100% bunk, that the elites who were selling them this lie and making this propaganda did not believe that at all, and they knew it to be untrue, if these men in their heart of hearts still believed that they were fighting for states' rights, and they made up obviously the bulk of the men in this war, could that not be said to be a part of the cause of the war?
First of all, the answer is obviously no, because cause and fought over are different things. Soldiers themselves didn't choose to start a war. Politicians started the war. The general public started the war. You're looking at different things. Secondly, the idea that most Southerners didn't care about slavery is bogus. Now, not every Southerner was obsessed with preserving slavery, but protecting slavery, which was, after all, the cornerstone of the South's entire economic and social system, was actually important as one factor among several in getting Southerners to sign up to fight. There are whole books written about why soldiers fought in the Civil War. One is For Cause and Comrades, Why Men Fought in the Civil War by James M. McPherson. He looks at thousands of letters and diaries of over 1,000 Civil War soldiers. As he summarizes, convictions of duty, honor, patriotism, and ideology function as the principal sustaining motivations of Civil War soldiers, while the impulses of courage, self-respect, and group cohesion were the main sources of combat motivation. I can show you a bunch of quotes proving this, but I think we can all accept that as obvious. Soldiers on both sides believed they were fighting for their country, for liberty, for justice. That makes sense, okay? But what seems obvious to me, but for some reason isn't to Leather Apron Club, was that the South's sense of patriotism and ideology was about slavery. That was the main foundation of it. McPherson quotes, "This country without slave labor would be completely worthless," wrote a lieutenant in the 28th Mississippi in 1863. "We can only live and exist by that species of labor, and hence I am willing to fight to the last." A captain in the 8th Alabama also vowed to fight forever rather than submit to freeing Negroes among us. "We are fighting for rights and property bequeathed to us by our ancestors." But it wasn't just about owning slaves, it was about the whole social system. As he writes, many slaveholding soldiers also fought for white supremacy, as well as for the right of property in slaves. An Arkansas captain was enraged by the idea that if the Yankees won, his sister, wife, and mother are to be given up to the embraces of their present dusky male servitors. After reading Lincoln's proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction in December 1863, which required Southern acceptance of emancipation as a condition of peace, another Arkansas soldier, a planter, wrote his wife that Lincoln not only wanted to free the slaves, but also declares them entitled to all the rights and privileges of American citizens. So imagine your sweet little girls in the schoolroom with a black, woolly-headed Negro and have to treat them as their equal. It would be wrong, however, to assume that Confederate soldiers were constantly preoccupied with this matter. In fact, only 20% of the sample of 429 Southern soldiers explicitly voiced pro-slavery convictions in their letters or diaries. Slavery was less salient for most Confederate soldiers because it was not controversial. They took slavery for granted as one of the Southern rights and institutions for which they fought, and did not feel compelled to discuss it. Here's one example. "We are fighting for our liberty," wrote a young Kentucky Confederate, "against tyrants of the North who are determined to destroy slavery." Regarding Northern soldiers' motivations, they were the mirror image of the South. McPherson writes, "If emancipation per se meant a perception that the abolition of slavery was inseparably linked to the goal of preserving the Union, then 3 in 10 Union soldiers whose letters and diaries formed the basis of this book took that position during the first 18 months of the war, and many more were eventually converted to it. While restoration of the Union was the main goal for which they fought, they became convinced that this goal was unattainable without striking against slavery." Okay, let's go back to Leather Apron Club. After his introductory screed, he gets into why the North fought the war. I could nitpick him a lot. For example, he brings up how only a small portion of Northerners considered themselves abolitionist or were members of abolitionist organizations. Then he provides a number, 100,000 out of 22 million. This has no source, but let's assume it's true. He says, afterwards, that that's the number of people who were members of abolitionist organizations. There is, of course, a difference between the number of people who were abolitionist in conviction and who were members of specific abolitionist organizations. He provides a number for one, then says it's for both. In any case, Northerners overwhelmingly voted for Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party in the elections of 1860 and beforehand, and they were opposed to slavery, though not all of them were outright radical abolitionists. Plus, what's more important than the general public is what the politicians believed, and many Northern politicians did actually oppose slavery. Abraham Lincoln didn't want to immediately abolish it, but he was in fact hostile to slavery. You can read the Republican Party platform of 1860. They specifically state their opposition to slavery in the territories of the United States, which the South viewed as the first step in a campaign of abolitionism. In Abraham Lincoln's 1858 House Divided speech, which was quoted multiple times by the secessionists, he said, "Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." So Lincoln wasn't proposing immediate abolition, but the Southern radicals heard exactly what they feared from the first chunk of that quote, that Lincoln was coming for them. In his annual address of 1862, Lincoln called for an amendment to compensate states for gradually abolishing slavery, which would of course include the border states in the Union that kept slavery. This really only makes sense if Lincoln believed slavery was like a bad thing, bad for the country, morally bad, either or. Another piece of evidence Leather Apron Club brings up is the Corwin Amendment. I can explain it quicker than him. The Corwin Amendment was a proposed amendment passed by just over 2/3 of the House and Senate, but not approved by enough states, that would have prohibited any future amendments that authorized Congress to abolish slavery. He says,
And this was, again, passed in the Senate, passed in the House, and it was on its way to be ratified by all these northern states. So the North, at least the politicians, at least people in power, were very much okay politically with slavery. So much so that they would have it for always and forever. So this narrative that Northerners were pretty much all staunchly abolitionists it's just absolutely ridiculous. Now moving on to another important figure, Lincoln. We'll talk about some of his...
First, the narrative doesn't exist. Leather Apron Club just made it up. Second, while the Corwin Amendment proves not everybody was a radical abolitionist in the northern half of the country, it was passed with the support of the middle states, like Maryland and Kentucky, and upper South states that soon seceded, like Virginia and Tennessee. Third, the Corwin Amendment proves plenty of politicians would prefer keeping the Union together over abolishing slavery, not that they didn't oppose slavery. Fourth, the representatives and senators who voted for the Corwin Amendment were not the newly elected ones in 1860, they were the previous ones. Fifth, the Corwin Amendment only narrowly passed with just over 2/3 support, so a full third of politicians in the northern half of the country would rather probably fight a civil war over keeping slavery. Sixth, the Corwin Amendment wasn't even enough to satisfy the secessionists. I see online sometimes people bring up, if the South really seceded for slavery, how come they didn't return to the Union when they passed the Corwin Amendment? First of all, they didn't, but also, as historian Daniel W. Cross writes, its Kentucky supporters tempered their enthusiasm by observing that the amendment did not secure to the slave states all the rights to which they are justly entitled, and therefore could not be considered a comprehensive adjustment of existing difficulties. In the peace conference they held, they had greater demands than just the Corwin Amendment. Seventh, the Corwin Amendment wasn't actually approved by the states, obviously, though of course a big reason for that was the whole crisis of Fort Sumter, so it doesn't really prove that much. Next, Leather Apron Club talks about Abraham Lincoln, who he admits was opposed to slavery, but accurately points out his priority was preserving the Union. Even if his evidence isn't that good, I agree with his overall argument in this section that the North did not set off at the start of the Civil War to abolish slavery. Though the North was not agnostic as he seems to suggest, preserving the Union was just more important than abolishing slavery overall to the North. Anyways, 17 minutes and 51 seconds into a video ostensibly about the cause of the Civil War, Leather Apron Club starts to talk about why the South seceded.
Now I'm going to get into what was considered the motivations for war in the South at the time, and these are primarily economic. Now, to begin, it goes a while back. It goes to the Tariff of 1828.
Nope, it doesn't, actually. We read through each state's decision to secede, and tariffs were simply not an important issue. While the South broadly opposed tariffs, they cared much more about the threat against slavery posed by Lincoln and the Republican Party. They literally said that. Anyways, Leather Apron Club talks about what a tariff is. He brings up the nullification crisis of 1828, which was a separate crisis a generation before the Civil War. Then he says,
now, again, to gloss over a couple decades of histories of the history of tariffs and taxes, the next big tax, the tariff that broke, the straw that broke the camel's back, was the Morrill Tariff, M-O-R-I-L-L, named after a man, named after Morrill. This was passed on March 2nd, 1861, a month before the start of the Civil War, about a month and a half. It was the highest tariff yet imposed on the South. They saw tariffs of 55% plus on some of the things that they had to import. So it was absolutely devastating for them, and they were already fed up. This led the Southerners, in direct response to this, to make their own constitution. And this constitution, by the way, it banned high import tariffs that were like the ones that were being imposed upon them.
First, he spelled the name wrong. It's not
M-O-R-I-L-L.
It's M-O-R-R-I-L-L. It's just insane that 130,000 people have watched this video, and this guy's making like obvious typos. Second, notice the date that he provides, March 2nd, 1861. Well, if Leather Apron Club knew anything about the Civil War, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had all seceded before the Morrill Tariff was even passed. The first shots of the Civil War were at Sumter, but the two sides were already set up against each other on the chessboard beforehand. How could the Civil War be caused by something that happened after all those states already seceded? We also looked over the motivations of the states that seceded after the Morrill Tariff, which were Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And the tariff was a secondary issue if it was mentioned at all. They were all concerned that, after Lincoln's call for volunteers, that he would become a tyrant and abolish slavery. If you don't believe me, rewind the video and watch that section again. You can even click on the sources I cited and search through for mentions of tariffs or taxes. You're not going to find many compared to the dozens of mentions of slaves and slavery and the danger of the North. Furthermore, the Confederate Constitution did not ban high import tariffs. Leather Apron Club just made that up. What it did prohibit was any duties or taxes on importations from foreign nations be laid to promote or foster any branch of industry, and all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the Confederate States. So it's not a prohibition of high tariffs, it's a prohibition of biased tariffs. In that very same constitutional article, it gave the Confederate Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises for revenue necessary to pay the debts, provide for the common defense, and carry on the government of the Confederate States. But even if we fully granted Leather Apron Club this point, which I don't think you should, but let's say we do, the Confederate Constitution had a bunch of articles about protecting slavery. It banned any bill of attainder ex post facto law or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves. It also declared the citizens of each state shall have the right of transit and sojourn in any state of this Confederacy with their slaves and other property, and the right of property in said slaves shall not be thereby impaired. It also said, no slave or other person held to service or labor in any state or territory of the Confederate States under the laws thereof, escaping or lawfully carried into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such slave belongs, or to whom such service or labor may be due. In any territory of the Confederate States, Negro slavery as it now exists in the Confederate States shall be recognized and protected by Congress and by the territorial government, and the inhabitants of the several Confederate States and territories shall have the right to take to such territory any slaves lawfully held by them in any of the states or territories of the Confederate States. So the Confederate Constitution, while it tweaked and modified the U.S. Constitution to address various gripes with the North, devoted most of its changes to protecting slavery. You don't need to just trust me. I just read the Constitution, but maybe you don't believe that. What about the Vice President of the Confederate States, Alexander H. Stephens? Well, he mentions the new change on tariffs. He says, not to be tedious in enumerating the numerous changes for the better, allow me to allude to one other. Though last, not least, the new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery as it exists among us. The proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization, this was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. While Stephens liked the old Constitution, he disagreed with the idea slavery would eventually fade away, as Jefferson and others presumed. As he said, they rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. President Jefferson Davis gave very similar speeches, though he doesn't get much credit for it. On April 29, 1861, he addressed the Confederate Congress and gave a lengthy diatribe about the history of the North's campaign against slavery, including ignoring the fugitive slave laws and attempting to prohibit slavery from the territories. He says, finally, a great party was organized for the purpose of obtaining the administration of the government with the avowed object of using its power for the total exclusion of the slave states from all participation in the benefits of the public domain acquired by all the states in common, whether by conquest or purchase, of surrounding them entirely by states in which slavery should be prohibited, of thus rendering the property in slaves so insecure as to be comparatively worthless, and thereby annihilating in effect property worth thousands of millions of dollars. This party, thus organized, succeeded in the month of November last in the election of its candidate for the presidency of the United States. So in conclusion, looking at the actual evidence available shows the South seceded to protect slavery. But one last thing before ending the video, I know the Confederate simps are going to bring up this argument, but the CSA offered to abolish slavery to get British help. But the truth is, some Southerners throughout the Civil War thought Southern independence more important than preserving slavery. It's true. There were very few of them, though. Very few of them ever proposed the idea of selling slavery for British aid. In November 1864, with the Confederacy obviously about to lose, Jefferson Davis began to consider just that very thing. In 1865, Davis sent Congressman Duncan F. Kenner to Europe to cut a deal. Except, as far as I can tell, the deal would be for gradual emancipation. Since Davis knew the Confederacy was going down the drain and slavery with it, he was trying to preserve slavery for as long as possible. If they didn't get British help, the Confederacy would lose and the North would abolish slavery. If they got British help, they could preserve slavery for longer and maybe they could, bend the rules a little bit. And you know what? My evidence for this is that the diplomats simply did not directly offer to abolish slavery. James M. Mason reported that it will be seen that I made no distinct suggestion of what the president considered might be the latent difficulty about recognition. They didn't even propose it to the British people. Mason asked a pro-Confederate British man named Lord Dunmore, "Suppose I should now go to Lord Palmerston and make a proposition, to wit, that in the event of present recognition, measures would be taken satisfactory to the British government for the abolition of slavery, not suddenly and at once, but so as to ensure abolition in a fair and reasonable time. Would your government then recognize us?" He replied that the time had gone by now, especially that our fortunes seemed more adverse than ever. The Confederate States lost soon afterward. So, while people like to bring up the South wanting to abolish slavery for British help, they didn't really actually want to do that, and they didn't actually offer that either. Anyways, comment your thoughts below, and if you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and support the channel on patreon.com/whatwhyhow for early access to future videos. Thanks to those who already do, and adios.